Part 1: Unlocking the Secrets of Personality Type. 1. Suit yourself. The secret of career satisfaction. It's important to find the right job. Despite the universal fantasies of winning the lottery, buying expensive cars and homes, and doing fascinating work with interesting people in exotic places, the sober reality is that most of us have to work hard for a long time. If you spend 40 to 50 years, not an unlikely scenario, working at jobs you'd rather not be doing, you are in truth throwing away a large part of your life. This is unnecessary and sad, especially since a career you can love is within your reach. What is the ideal job, anyway? The right job enhances your life. It is personally fulfilling because it nourishes the most important aspects of your personality. It suits the way you like to do things and reflects who you are. It lets you use your innate strengths in ways that come naturally to you, and it doesn't force you to do things you don't do well. How can you tell if you're in the right job? Here are some general guidelines. If you're not employed, keep them in mind as you search for your ideal job. If you are employed, see how your present job measures up. If you're in the right job, you should look forward to going to work, feel energized by what you do, feel your contribution is respected and appreciated, feel proud when describing your work to others, enjoy and respect the people you work with, feel optimistic about your future. We'd like to make something clear right away. It's important to recognize that there are as many different paths to career satisfaction as there are happily employed people. There is no one ideal job to which everyone should aspire, but there is an ideal job for you. There are an infinite number of variables in the workplace. To achieve career satisfaction, you need to figure out what your preferences are and then find a job that accommodates them. Some jobs provide warmth and stability. Some are risky and challenging. Some are structured, some aren't. One job may require a lot of socializing, while another may require quiet concentration. Do you know exactly what kind of job suits you best? Have you ever even stopped to think about it? It's a good thing there are so many different kinds of jobs available, since people are so different in their abilities and priorities. Some people enjoy making high-level management decisions. Others simply aren't suited to making these kinds of choices. For some people, money is a top priority. They want to make lots of it. Others, however, want most to make a contribution to society. The money is less important. Some people are perfectly comfortable with facts and details and statistics, while others get a headache just trying to read a profit and loss statement. And so on, and so on. When we were hired to conduct a series of personal effectiveness training workshops for job placement professionals, we came face to face with a dramatic example of how a job that is perfect for one person can be perfectly wrong for another. We were training several headhunters who worked for the same recruiting firm. Their job was to find applicants to fill positions at a variety of companies by contacting people who were already employed and convincing them to apply for these positions. If an applicant successfully switched jobs and stayed with the new company for at least 3 months, the placement counselor received a generous commission. It was a highly competitive, results-oriented job that required excellent communication skills and the ability to fill as many positions as possible as quickly as possible. One of the placement counselors we trained, Arthur, couldn't have been happier. He loved the fast pace of the job. Arthur was a high-energy person, a great talker who enjoyed meeting lots of people. He used his excellent reasoning skills to persuade other people to make a move to a new opportunity, and he got a lot of satisfaction out of meeting his goal and then some. Arthur knew and understood the formula. For every 50 attempts he made, he'd get 10 people who were interested. And out of these 10, he might make 2 or 3 placements. Arthur's thick skin helped him in the job. He often heard no during the day, but he never took the rejection personally. What Arthur found really energizing was closing the sale and moving on to the next challenge. He worked hard all day long and made a lot of money. For Julie, it was a totally different story. Like Arthur, Julie enjoyed talking to lots of people all day and establishing relationships with them. However, unlike Arthur, Julie wanted to help each person find the job that would be really right for them. She liked to look for opportunities that would enable her applicants to grow and experience personal success and satisfaction. Julie had been cautioned repeatedly by her supervisor about spending too much time with each individual rather than quickly determining whether or not someone was interested in a position and then moving on to the next prospect. Rather than filling jobs, Julie was counseling clients. The fact that she could make a great deal of money did not motivate her. She found little reward in simply filling a job opening with a person who probably wasn't right for the position but whom she had successfully pressured into giving it a try. When we returned 6 weeks later for a follow-up training session, we weren't surprised to learn that Julie had quit. People are different in their needs, desires, interests, skills, values, and personalities. Unless you and I have similar personality types, work that you find intrinsically enjoyable is likely to have a different, even opposite, effect on me. Different jobs and even different aspects of jobs satisfy different types of people. A fundamental truth which has, in our view, not been fully appreciated by career advisors or career manuals, Until now, to suit yourself, you must know yourself, as we said earlier. The secret of career satisfaction lies in doing what you enjoy most. The few lucky people discover this secret early in life, but most of us are caught in a kind of psychological wrestling match. Torn between what we think we can do, what we feel we ought to do, and what we think we want to do. Our advice: concentrate instead on who you are, and the rest will fall into place. Not long ago, our friend Ellen called us. This friend was mad. A co-worker of hers whom she regarded as the most boring man on earth had been given a prime assignment, designing a complex computer system upgrade for a growing retail chain. Ellen, who had been hired just 6 months before to do exactly this kind of work, was stunned. Obviously something was wrong, but what? Ellen had evaluated her new job with the utmost care before accepting it. She had both the analytical ability and the background experience the job required. She was well liked and found the technical aspects of the job challenging. She'd had a series of unsatisfying jobs before, but this one was going to be different. So what was going on here? We thought we knew the answer. Ellen's co-worker, as she described him, was absolutely content to work long hours in relative isolation, quietly but steadily getting the job done. He wasn't a lot of fun around the office, but he was intelligent and dependable. And he never made waves. He was, in fact, the perfect person for the job, and he was happy doing it. Ellen, on the other hand, loved the stimulation of rallying her staff for an urgent deadline and enjoyed talking to clients about their needs. She was terrific at explaining the intricacies of computer systems and could charm people into doing remarkable things. She liked going to industry conferences, and she didn't mind spending all day in meetings. Unfortunately, none of these activities were a significant part of her new position. It was clear to us that even though Ellen could handle her responsibilities adequately, the job required more solitude, concentration, and what we call task focus than she liked. As she talked things through, she began to recognize that in all her careful planning she had overlooked just one thing: her own personality. At this point in our conversation, Ellen panicked. She was afraid she had spent 8 years in the wrong career. No wonder she'd found her previous jobs less than thrilling. However, she wasn't actually in the wrong field. She was just working in the wrong end of it. Ellen moved over into the sales division of the same company, and today she is thriving in her new position. Perhaps a little experiment will clarify what we're talking about. On a piece of paper, or even in the margin, write your signature. Done. Okay, now do the same thing, using your opposite hand. How did it feel when you used your preferred hand? Most people use words like natural, easy, quick, effortless. How did it feel when you used the opposite hand? Some typical responses: slow, awkward, hard, draining, tiring. It took much longer. It required more energy and concentration. We think that handedness is a good way to think about using your natural strengths in your work. The use of your preferred hand is comfortable and assured. If you were forced to use your other hand, you could no doubt develop your abilities. But using that hand would never be as effortless as using your preferred hand, and the finished product would never be as skillfully executed. The traditional approach, and why it doesn't work. Career professionals have long been aware that certain kinds of people are better at certain types of jobs, and that it's important to find as good a match as possible between the person you are and the kind of job you choose. The problem is that the traditional approach doesn't take enough considerations into account. The conventional analysis looks at only the big three: your abilities, interests, and values. As career counselors ourselves, we recognize the importance of these factors. Certainly, you need the right skills to perform a job well. It also helps if you're interested in your work, and it's important to feel good about what you do. But this is far from the whole picture. Your personality has additional dimensions that also need to be recognized. As a general rule, the more aspects of your personality you match to your work, the more satisfied you'll be on the job. As we saw with Ellen, a vital consideration, often overlooked, is how much stimulation from other people you need in your work. Are you more energized by being around lots of people most of the time? Or are you more comfortable in small groups, talking one-on-one? Or maybe working alone? You can see what a profound impact this preference can have upon your choice of a job. Other important factors include the kind of information you naturally notice, the way you make decisions, and whether you prefer to live in a more structured or a more spontaneous way. These preferences reflect mental processes that are basic to every human being but that clearly differ from one personality type to another. Trying to find the best job for you without taking these preferences into account is like trying to find a tiny island in the vast ocean without a chart. With luck, you might get there, but you might not. Joanne was a client of ours who came to us in a career crisis. At the age of 30, she was at the end of her rope. After 7 years of teaching math at the elementary school level, she was completely burned out and was wondering if she was in the right career. Being a teacher had seemed the most natural thing in the world for Joanne. The eldest of 4, she had grown up taking care of children. She had excelled in math throughout school and was interested in education. Joanne had received some career counseling early on, and all the signs had seemed to point in the same direction. In high school, and again in college, Joanne had taken the standard career aptitude tests and assessment instruments to determine her skills, her interests, and her values. Each time, career counselors had encouraged her to obtain a teaching degree and to teach math to young kids. Everything seemed perfect. After her first challenging year, Joanne became increasingly frustrated with the rigid structure of the public elementary school setting. She disliked the endless rules both she and the students had to live by, as well as many of the rules she had to enforce. She hated having to prepare lesson plans 6 weeks in advance that left her unable to respond to the interests of the children and to her own creative inspirations. She found the standard workbooks inane, and the busy work that both she and her students were required to do left her drained and irritated. Joanne felt very isolated because her colleagues all seemed to have interests and values that were not like hers. And she began to discover that she missed the stimulation of working on challenging projects with others who shared her interests. She had tried switching grades and even changing schools, but nothing seemed to help. After talking with us, Joanne was relieved to discover that she wasn't crazy. She was just in the wrong career. As her early counselors had determined, Joanne had many of the right qualifications for teaching. However, the things she found most stimulating, intellectual challenge, opportunities to raise her level of competence, and creative innovation, were lacking in her job. Moreover, the public school setting forced her to work in a highly structured and detailed way, which was not at all the way she liked to operate. Luckily, the solution quickly became clear. We suggested that Joanne return to school and obtain a master's degree in order to teach math, still a thriving interest of hers. In higher education, in a college setting, she would be able to enjoy much more flexibility in her work schedule and obligations, teach more complicated courses, and be part of a culture of academia. Joanne did get a master's degree, and shortly thereafter she accepted a position in the math department of a small college. Today she teaches graduate-level math courses while continuing her studies toward obtaining a PhD. There's also another reason why the traditional approach to career counseling is inadequate. The big three, your abilities, interests, and values, all change with age. As you gain work experience, you gain new skills. As you live longer, you may pick up new interests and discard old ones. And often your goals are different later in life than they were earlier. You can keep changing your career according to where you find yourself at a particular point in time, or you can base your choice from the beginning on a deeper understanding of who you are. Alex is a 39-year-old internist with a successful practice in a Chicago suburb. While he was growing up, it was always assumed that he would follow in the family tradition and become a doctor. Through 12 years of college, medical school, internship, and residency, he never allowed himself to question his decision. After practicing medicine for 5 years, he has come to a painful conclusion with far-reaching implications for himself and his family. He doesn't want to be a doctor anymore. What's more, he realizes he probably never did. Alex's predicament is not unusual. If you doubt this, pick any 10 people you know and ask them, if you could have any job you wanted, what would it be? Our experience as career counselors suggests that at least half would rather be doing something else. Most of us make our most important career decisions when we are least prepared to do so. The decisions we make early in life set into motion a chain of events that will influence our entire lives. Yet when we're young, we have little or no experience making job choices, and we tend to have an overabundance of idealistic enthusiasm, plus a reckless lack of concern for future consequences. We haven't lived long enough to see ourselves tested in a variety of situations, and we're highly susceptible to bad advice from well-intentioned parents, teachers, counselors, or friends. No wonder so many people get off to a poor start. The solution: to achieve as great a degree of self-awareness as you can before making any decision with long-lasting career consequences. Happily, finding yourself does not require a guru, a lot of money, or any period of experimentation. You can't help it, you were born that way. Since the right job flows directly out of all the elements of your personality type, you need to spend some time figuring out what makes you tick. By making a conscious effort to discover the real you, you can learn how to focus your natural strengths and inclinations into a career you can love for as long as you choose to work. This is where type is so helpful. It provides a systematic, effective way to evaluate both your strong points and your probable blind spots. Once you have these figured out, you'll know how to make sure you are always operating from a position of strength. Each one of us has a distinct personality, like an innate blueprint that stays with us for life. We are born with a personality type, we go through life with that type, and when we are laid to rest, it is with the same type. Now you are probably wondering, wait a minute, I might be one way sometimes, but at other times I'm a very different person. Doesn't the situation influence my personality type? The answer is no, it doesn't. Do we change our behavior in certain situations? Certainly, most human beings have a tremendous repertoire of behaviors available to them. We couldn't function very successfully if we didn't. Sure, we act differently at work than we do at home, and it makes a difference whether we're with strangers, close friends, at a ballpark, or at a funeral. But people don't change their basic personalities with every new door they walk through. All this is not to say that environmental factors are not extremely important. They are. Parents, siblings, teachers, and economic, social, and political circumstances all can play a role in determining what directions our lives take. Some people are forced by circumstances to act in a certain way until they are literally not themselves. But we all start off with a particular personality type that predisposes us to behave in certain ways for our entire lives. If you are skeptical about the idea that personality type is inborn, take a look at different children from the same family. These could be your own children, your siblings, or even children from a family you know. Do they have different personalities? You bet they do, and often the differences are apparent from birth. The concept of personality type is not new. People have always been aware of the similarities and differences between individuals, and over the centuries many systems and models for understanding or categorizing these differences have been developed. Today, our understanding of human behavior has been expanded to such a degree that we are now able to accurately identify 16 distinctly different personality types. Finding the right job for each of these distinct personalities may seem like an awesome task. However, all 16 personality types do function in the world. As we will see, it is possible to identify your own personality type and the types of others, to understand why certain types flourish in certain kinds of jobs, and to clarify why people find career satisfaction in different ways. Just who do you think you are? Discovering your personality type. In this chapter you'll learn how type works, and, even better, you'll discover your own personality type. But before we assist you in identifying your type, we think it would be helpful for you to know something about how type has come to be used by so many people in so many different ways. A brief history of type. The concept of personality type owes its existence to the work of the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung and two American women, Catherine Briggs and her daughter, Isabel Briggs Myers. Jung, an eclectic psychoanalyst and disciple of Sigmund Freud, realized that behavior that seemed unpredictable could in fact be anticipated if one understood the underlying mental function and attitudes people preferred. While Jung was making his discoveries, Catherine Briggs, who had long been intrigued with similarities and differences between human personalities, began to develop her own system for typing people. In 1921, Jung's theory of personality was published in a book called Psychological Types. When Catherine read the English translation published in 1923, she realized that Jung had already discovered what she had been looking for. So she adopted his model and began a serious study of his work. Fortunately for us, she interested her young daughter Isabel in her pursuit. The study of personality type, and the discussion of the subject in this book, owe a substantial debt to the pioneering research and writing of Catherine Briggs and her daughter, Isabel Briggs Myers. Myers and Briggs built upon the theoretical work related to type done by Carl Jung, and both expanded it and gave it a practical application. Jung posited that there existed 3 personality preference scales and 8 personality types. Catherine Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers determined, based on their many years of study, that there were 4 personality preference scales and 16 distinct personality types. These are the 16 personality types that we discuss in this book. Much of our discussion derives from the writings of Isabel Briggs Myers and other authors who, like her, are published by Consulting Psychologists Press. Certain material and quotations contained in this book are published with the permission of Consulting Psychologists Press, Inc. Starting in the 1940s, Catherine Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers began developing the MBTI test instrument, a detailed test to measure psychological type, which has been refined and improved over the years. Moreover, data from the MBTI test has been collected and analyzed from the time the test was first given, providing scientific validation for the MBTI test and the results it yields, as Isabel Briggs Myers determined, and as our experience has verified over and over again. There are 16 different personality types, and every person fits into one of them. This is not to say that people are not all unique, for they certainly are. 100 people of the same personality type in a room would all be different because they have different parents, genes, experiences, interests, and so on, but they would also have a tremendous amount in common. Identifying your personality type helps you discover and learn how to take advantage of that commonality. As you become more familiar with type, you'll see that all personality types are equally valuable, with inherent strengths and blind spots. There are no better or worse, smarter or duller, or healthier or sicker types. Type does not determine intelligence or predict success. nor does it indicate how well-adjusted anyone will be. It does, however, help us discover what best motivates and energizes each of us as individuals, and this in turn empowers us to seek these elements in the work we choose to do. How to determine your personality type, as we discussed earlier. One way to determine your personality type is to complete the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator instrument and have the results interpreted by a trained professional. However, since that is not practical for the purposes of this book, we offer another method that we have used to successfully help hundreds of clients discover their true types. The first of this two-step process begins with reading the following section, in which we describe each of the 4 dimensions of personality type. As you read about each type dimension, think about which preference sounds more like you. Most of what you read about your preference will ring true for you, but remember, the preferences are generalities and represent the extremes. Try to focus not on isolated examples of each preference, but rather on a pattern of behavior that is more consistently like you than its opposite. Even if one example sounds just like you, see how you feel about all the others before making up your mind. At the end of the discussion of each dimension, you'll find a continuum. Please place a check mark along the continuum at the point which you think most accurately reflects how strong your preference is. The closer your mark is to the center of the scale, the less clear your preference is, the farther away your mark is, the stronger your preference is. Even if you are not certain of your preference, try to indicate if you can which side of the midpoint you probably fall on, because what is most helpful in determining your type is which side of each scale you prefer, not how clear or unclear your preference is. By estimating your type preference for each of the 4 type dimensions in this way, you will end up with a 4-letter code. For most of you, that code will represent your personality type, or one that is very close to it. Toward the end of this chapter, we will provide a space for you to record the letters of your type code. The second step in identifying your type comes after you've read the descriptions of the preferences and made your estimates, but that happens just a little later on. Now it's time to learn about personality type. The 4 dimensions of personality type. The type system of personality assessment is based on 4 basic aspects of human personality: how we interact with the world and where we direct our energy, the kind of information we naturally notice, how we make decisions, and whether we prefer to live in a more structured way or in a more spontaneous way. We call these aspects of human personality dimensions because each one can be pictured as a continuum between opposite extremes. Like this: how we interact with the world and where we direct our energy. Extroversion, introversion, the kind of information we naturally notice, sensing, intuition, how we make decisions, thinking, feeling, whether we prefer to live in a more structured way or in a more spontaneous way. Judging, perceiving. Everyone's personality falls onto one side of the midpoint or the other on each of these 4 scales. We call the opposite ends of the scales preferences. If you fall on the extroverted side, for example, then you are said to have a preference for extroversion. If you fall on the introverted side, your preference is for introversion. In reality, you use both sides of each scale in daily life, but you also have an innate preference for one side or the other. Remember the exercise in which you used each hand to write your name. Your preference is generally more comfortable, automatic, and trustworthy. For these reasons, you are most successful while using it. If you don't have a particularly pronounced preference on one continuum, you may be just slightly to one side of the midpoint. If you have an extreme preference, you'll find yourself at one end or the other. People with strong preferences who find themselves at the opposite ends of a scale are very different from each other. For the time being, don't worry too much about the terms used to describe the 4 dimensions. In some cases, these terms don't mean exactly what you think they do. Although they are words you know, they mean something different in this context. We'll explain them in detail shortly. You'll notice that since each continuum has opposite preferences at either end, there are 8 preferences in all, each represented by a particular letter. These letters are used in combination to designate the 16 personality types. Your particular combination of preferences is more meaningful than any one preference by itself. By now you may be wondering what is magical about 16. Why aren't there 12 personality types, or 20, or 200? The answer lies in simple mathematics. If you calculate all the possible combinations of the 8 letters, you end up with 16 possible types. It's easier to visualize them when organized in a chart, like the one originally suggested by Isabel Briggs Myers. Everyone fits into one of these 16 categories. Although type is systematic, it is also flexible. It is limited enough to be useful but accommodating enough to fit everyone. Extroversion, introversion. The first dimension of personality type concerns how we prefer to interact with the world and where we direct our energy. Carl Jung originated the concepts of extroversion and introversion to describe how we live in the world outside ourselves and the world inside ourselves. Each of us has a natural preference for either the outer or inner world, although by necessity we all function in both. Functioning in our preferred world energizes us. Functioning in the opposite world is more difficult and can be tiring. We call those who prefer the outer world extroverts and those who prefer the inner world introverts. Most people think that extroverted means talkative and introverted means shy. This is a good example of how the terms used to describe the type preferences can be somewhat misleading. There is far more to extroversion and introversion than talkativeness. Because they focus their energy in opposite directions, there are clear, distinct, and profound differences between extroverts and introverts. Extroverts focus their attention and energy on the world outside of themselves. They seek out other people and enjoy lots of interaction, whether one-on-one or in groups. They are constantly pulled to the outer world of people and things. Because extroverts need to experience the world to understand it, they tend to like a lot of activity. Extroverts get their batteries charged up by being with others and usually know a lot of people. Because they like to be at the center of the action and are approachable, they tend to meet new people frequently and with ease. Extroverts look at a situation and ask themselves, how do I affect this? Introverts focus their attention and energy on the world inside of themselves. They enjoy spending time alone and need this time to recharge their batteries. Introverts try to understand the world before they experience it, which means a lot of their activity is mental. They prefer social interaction on a smaller scale, one-on-one or in small groups. Introverts avoid being the center of attention and are generally more reserved than extroverts. They prefer to get to know new people slowly. Introverts look at a situation and ask themselves, how does this affect me? Peter, a true extrovert, puts it this way: when I return from a trip to the supermarket, my wife always asks me, well, was it a success? You might assume that she's checking to see if I got everything I needed, but in fact, knowing how extroverted I am, what she really means is, how many people did you see whom you know? To me, interacting with people, especially friends, is fun and energizing. I love the fact that no matter where I go, I'll almost always run into someone I know. Brent, who is quite introverted, feels just the opposite. I like people, he explains, but I don't care for quick, superficial exchanges. My wife loves parties, but I just find them exhausting. To me, it's draining and unsatisfying to have to meet all those people whose names I can't remember and whom I'll probably never see again. What's the point? Someone's preference for extroversion or introversion can be seen in practically everything they do. For example, take the study habits of Jill, a college sophomore. As Jill explains it, I always prefer to study with friends. In one class we have a study group which really works out well. If no one is around, I'll go to the library. I find it much less boring than sitting alone in my dorm room reading by myself. At the library I can always find somebody I know to take a break with. We think it's safe to say that usually most extroverts don't really go to the library to study. They go there to be with other people. If you don't know what an extrovert is thinking, you haven't been listening, because they will tell you. If you don't know what an introvert is thinking, you haven't asked, or, in some cases, you haven't waited long enough for an answer. Asked a question, an extrovert will usually start talking, because extroverts are most comfortable doing their thinking out loud. In fact, extroverts often need to talk to think. On the other hand, there will often be a pause before an introvert answers a question, because introverts are more comfortable thinking silently. Introverts bake their ideas inside, much as cake is cooked in the oven and presented to the outside world only after it is finished. Extroverts only partially bake their ideas inside, preferring to finish them out in the world. However, extroverts do finish their ideas eventually. Sean, another extrovert, recalls, when I was in elementary school, I used to get all excited when I wanted the teacher to call on me. I would wave my whole arm so vigorously I had to hold it up with my other hand to keep from getting tired. But when the teacher finally did call on me, I often didn't know the answer. Naturally, she would say something very sensitive and understanding, like, if you don't know the answer, then why did you raise your hand? I didn't know then, but I know now. I needed to talk the answer out. I just couldn't think it through quietly in my head. Unlike Sean, introverted students need time to form their answers in their minds before they can respond to a teacher's question. Since many elementary school teachers are extroverts, they tend to move quickly from one child to the next. In our workshops, we have trained teachers to wait just a few seconds after asking an introverted child a question. And we hear from these teachers that their class participation rates have tripled. Many extroverts find that their preference helps them at work because they generally can think quickly on their feet. When asked a question, they just start talking. Eventually they come up with an answer. And usually they can persuade others that it makes sense. Maja, like most introverts, had a different experience. I'll never forget how frustrating my first job was for me, she told us. It seemed as if everybody in the company, including my boss, was a huge extrovert. For one thing, I was always being forced to do group activities, like attending brainstorming sessions and sales conferences. And we were always having meetings. But even worse, my boss wouldn't give me enough time to answer his questions. I guess he thought I was stupid, or else he figured I was taking so long because I didn't know the answer. Extroverts tend to be much more public than introverts and share personal information freely. Introverts are more private, as is demonstrated by a situation that Bailey, an introvert, experienced. A new co-worker in our department had heard that I was a good cook, reported Bailey. So she kept badgering me to invite her over for dinner. Finally I did, and the meal went fine. But the next day, she began telling everyone at our weekly staff meeting about the great meal I'd made. Her effusive compliments were bad enough, but then she went on to describe, in great detail, the contents of my entire house. She talked all about the personal treasures I've been collecting for the past 30 years. I was furious. If I'd wanted all my co-workers to know that much about me, I'd have invited them over myself and conducted a tour. The extroverted co-worker, incidentally, was mortified to learn that she had violated Bailey's privacy. She'd had the best of intentions and thought she'd only been sincerely complimenting Bailey's good taste. It's important to recognize that the gift of extroversion is breadth, and the gift of introversion is depth. Usually extroverts are interested in many things, but not necessarily at a very deep level. Introverts have fewer interests, but they pursue them in much greater depth. Once you get an introvert talking about their interest, they may go on forever. Despite their best efforts to get out of it, Sam and Miguel found themselves at the annual holiday party given by the company where both their wives worked. Since both men are introverts, you can imagine the joy each felt as he anticipated spending the next 4 hours with 120 total strangers. Fortunately for both, they met early on while ordering drinks at the bar. After some uncomfortable small talk, they learned that each was an avid sailor. They spent the entire party talking boats, equipment, and cruising spots, and telling their disaster stories. Bill, whose wife works for the same company, couldn't wait to get to the party. He'd met many of the employees' spouses last year and he was eager to rekindle these acquaintances. As soon as they arrived, Bill and his wife, who was also an extrovert, went their separate ways, and by the end of the evening Bill had talked with 12 people, covering about twice as many topics. He and his wife were so charged up by all the stimulation that they moved the party down to the hotel lounge with another group of extroverts after everyone else left. Although there is some controversy as to how many extroverts and introverts there are in the world, the latest research suggests that the American population is about equally divided between extroverts and introverts. However, because extroverts tend to talk more and louder than introverts, there seems to be a fairly strong bias toward extroverts in our culture. Extroverts are energized by being with other people. Introverts are energized by spending time alone. Extroverts like being the center of attention. Introverts avoid being the center of attention. Extroverts act, then think. Introverts think, then act. Extroverts tend to think out loud. Introverts think things through inside their heads. Extroverts are easier to read and know, share personal information freely. Introverts are more private, prefer to share personal information with a select few. Extroverts talk more than listen. Introverts listen more than talk. Extroverts express enthusiasm readily. Introverts reveal enthusiasm more slowly. Extroverts respond quickly, enjoy a fast pace. Introverts respond after taking the time to think things through, enjoy a slower pace. Extroverts prefer breadth to depth. Introverts prefer depth to breadth. Now that you've read about extroverts and introverts, can you guess which one you are? Sometimes it's hard to decide between these two preferences because of the way we change with age or because of the demands made upon us by our jobs. If you are still undecided between extroversion and introversion, ask yourself this question: if I had to be one way or the other for the rest of my life, which would I choose? A thoughtful answer will often nudge the most ambivalent person in the direction of his or her true preference. Think about where your preference would fall on the continuum below. Extroversion, introversion, sensing. Intuition. The second dimension of personality type concerns the kind of information we naturally notice. Some people focus on what is, while others focus on what could be. These approaches, both valid, are fundamentally different. Again, some definitions are in order. We use the term sensing to describe the process of gathering data by means of the 5 senses. People who prefer sensing, we call them sensors, concentrate on what can be seen, heard, felt, smelled, or tasted. They trust whatever can be measured or documented and focus on what is real and concrete. Sensors trust their 5 senses to give them accurate information about the world, and they also trust their own personal experience. They are oriented to the present and concentrate on whatever is happening at the moment. A sensor will look at a situation and want to contextualize it based on their past experiences. While it's obvious that we all use our 5 senses to take in information, some people are more interested in meanings, relationships, and possibilities based on facts than in the facts themselves. You could say these people trust their 6th sense more than their other 5. Those who prefer intuition, we call them intuitives, naturally read between the lines and seek context for all things. Intuitives focus on implications and inferences. They are oriented toward the future. They tend to anticipate events and generally try to make things different rather than maintaining them the way they are. An intuitive will look at a situation and want to know what its implications might be. Everyone uses both sensing and intuition in daily life. Intuitives are well aware of the data their five senses bring in, and sensors can interpret the meaning of someone's words or figure out a new way to handle a problem. Even so, everyone has a preference for either sensing or intuition. We all use one process more naturally, more often, and with more success than the other. Intuitives are especially good at connecting disparate ideas to come up with a working theory about something. Sensors are especially good at noticing and remembering facts to help a theory hold water. The following story shows this idea in action. Elizabeth, a sensor, and Monique, an intuitive, worked together at a cosmetics manufacturing company. One day the president called all department heads together for a quarterly review. His tone was cheerful as he went through several slides related to the company's financial health, including the advertising budget, market share compared to their main competitor, and the business goals for the next period. The president ended the presentation abruptly. Monique and Elizabeth immediately went behind closed doors to compare notes. Monique mentioned that she had felt something was wrong as soon as she'd walked into the meeting, despite the president's cheerful tone, and wondered if perhaps there was more going on than had been indicated. Monique had noticed several department heads exchange furtive looks, and now remarked to Elizabeth that relations seemed particularly strained between the president and the vice president for research and development. Although nothing had been said about it at the meeting, Monique wondered if the company's greatly anticipated new skincare line, still in development, was not performing as well in trials as they had hoped. Elizabeth recollected a slide mentioning projected profits for the new line, and compared the numbers against the advertising budget she'd been working on. As she saw the discrepancy between the president's optimistic tone and the money allocated for advertising, she agreed with Monique's hunch. As it turned out, both Monique and Elizabeth were correct. A few days later the president broke the bad news, and for completely different reasons. As we've seen, neither Elizabeth nor Monique was surprised. Although they had noticed different red flags at the meeting, they arrived together at the same conclusion. Intuitives and sensors also approach tasks differently, as you can see in the next story. While sensors often take a pragmatic approach, collecting data and moving linearly through a process, intuitives are outside-the-box thinkers and may take a more inventive or novel path toward a solution. Lizzie and Maria are best friends, and they got engaged within months of each other. Naturally, they each were named maid of honor to the other. The two women started looking for wedding dresses. Lizzie tried on a dozen dresses, but she wasn't quite satisfied with any of them. The last dress she tried wasn't even a dress. It was a long, flowing skirt. Lizzie, an intuitive, had an unconventional idea. She could buy the skirt and ask a family friend to construct a top to go with it out of the extra fabric on the bottom. While it took some twists and turns to get there, Lizzie ended up with a beautiful, one-of-a-kind gown that she loved. She'd had a vision of what could be, and it paid off. Maria, a sensor, was more traditional in her approach. She first created a Pinterest board with dozens of dresses to home in on the elements she was sure she loved. When it came time to try on dresses, she fell in love with the second dress, which fit her exact list of requirements. In fact, the dress Maria ended up with was almost identical to the one she had always imagined for herself. Every detail was exactly to her liking, and she couldn't have been happier. Sensors have a great capacity for enjoying experiences in the here and now. Often they are content to let things be. Intuitives, on the other hand, anticipate the future and tend to agitate for change. Abdul, a sensor, and Jesse, an intuitive, frequently take long walks near the town reservoir. Abdul enjoys these walks because they put him back in touch with nature. He loves the smell of the woods and can identify most of the trees he passes. Best of all is watching the seasons change in real time. Often he'll notice something in bloom that 2 days before was just budding. Jessie likes being outdoors too. During their walks she spends much of her time thinking or talking about new ideas for her current project. The time outside talking with Abdul is invaluable to her as a place to brainstorm and bounce ideas. While she enjoys nature like he does, her pleasure comes more from what her surroundings inspire and remind her of than the trees and the flowers themselves. Both intuitives and sensors have important roles to play in organizations. Intuitives naturally focus on possibilities. Sensors naturally focus on realities. Variations on the same scenario are played out thousands of times daily across the country whenever the two types meet. Sensors and intuitives see the world in fundamentally different ways and sometimes can fail to appreciate the value of each other's perspective. As Alex, an intuitive, expresses it, "I'm an idea man. Nothing feels better to me than to take a troublesome situation and figure out a new approach that will make it work better. The problem with this company is that no one has any vision, especially my boss, Warren. I come to him with a terrific idea that can have a significant impact on the future of this company. And all he wants to know is what will it cost? How much time will it take? Who's going to do your job while you're out doing this new pet project? Now, Warren, a censor, sees things differently, as you might expect. Maybe it's because Alex is a more creative guy than I am, but frankly, I don't know where he comes up with half of his ideas. It's not that they're bad ideas, it's just that most of them are totally unrealistic. Alex doesn't understand what it takes to get things done around here. To recommend a plan to my boss, I have to present a well-thought-out cost-benefit analysis, which means I need to have realistic data concerning expenses, time frames, and the anticipated impact on the company. This all takes the kind of careful, methodical research that Alex doesn't seem to be interested in doing. Like extroverts, censors have something of an advantage in our society because there are more of them. About 65% of the American population are censors, which puts intuitives in the minority. Censors trust what is certain and concrete. Intuitives trust inspiration and inference. Censors like new ideas when they have practical applications. Intuitives like new ideas and concepts for their own sake. Censors value realism and common sense. Intuitives value imagination and innovation. Censors like to use and hone established skills. Intuitives like to learn new skills, get bored easily after mastering skills. Censors tend to be specific and literal, give detailed descriptions. Intuitives tend to be general and figurative, use metaphors and analogies. Censors present information in a step-by-step manner. Intuitives present information through leaps in a roundabout manner. Censors are oriented to the past and present. Intuitives are oriented toward the future. By now it should be clear that people really do take in information in two very different ways. Think about where your preference would fall on the continuum below. Sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling. The third dimension of personality type concerns the way in which we make decisions and come to conclusions. Just as there are two different ways of interacting with the world and two different ways of taking in information, so are there two different ways of making decisions, by means of thinking or feeling. In the context of type, thinking refers to making decisions impersonally, and feeling refers to making decisions based on personal values. Although emotions can play a part in decision-making, feeling here simply means making decisions based on what is important to you and others. Thinkers prefer decisions that make sense logically. They pride themselves on their ability to be objective and analytical in the decision-making process. They make decisions by analyzing and weighing the evidence, even if that means coming to unpleasant conclusions. Feelers make decisions based on how much they care or what they feel is right. They pride themselves on their ability to be empathetic and compassionate. Obviously, thinkers and feelers have very different priorities. Some people find it especially difficult to decide between thinking and feeling. Sometimes the terms carry certain connotations that may make one choice seem less desirable than the other. Also, in our culture there is a very strong gender bias regarding certain kinds of behavior. Different sex role expectations can cause some people to falsify their preference. A woman who is naturally a thinker may be socialized to behave more like a feeler, and a man who is naturally a feeler may be socialized to behave more like a thinker. When you read the following paragraphs, think about which preference suits the real you, not necessarily how you were raised or encouraged to be. For people who have been acting out of type for a long time, clarifying this preference can be an especially enlightening and liberating experience. As we have said before, everyone uses both preferences. Thinkers do have emotions and personal values, and feelers can be perfectly logical. However, each of us uses one process more naturally, more often, and more successfully than the other. Thinking is usually considered a rational way of making decisions, while a feeling approach is considered irrational. This is not the case. Thinking and feeling are both rational methods, they just use different criteria in the decision-making process. Take the example of Robert, a feeler, who is the assistant dean of students at a small liberal arts college. Robert is responsible for conducting disciplinary hearings for students accused of violating the college's rules. He also decides the appropriate punishments as needed. A student, Henry, was caught smoking marijuana in his dormitory, a violation that usually carries a penalty of suspension for 1 semester, followed by 2 semesters of probation. Looking into the case, Robert discovered that Henry, a freshman, had been assigned to a room with 2 upperclassmen who had both been in and out of trouble. Robert also learned that Henry had an excellent academic record, and he had never been in any trouble before. Henry appeared to be genuinely contrite, and he was terrified about how his parents might react if he were suspended, since they had made real sacrifices to send him to school. Taking all these things into consideration, Robert fixed Henry's punishment at mandatory attendance in a 6-week campus drug awareness program, followed by 1 semester of probation. The dean, a thinker, thought this punishment was too lenient and made no sense. She thought that failing to hold all students to the same standard set a dangerous precedent, and she asked Robert to justify his decision. As Robert put it, "I know I could have suspended Henry, but I looked at the situation this way: we never should have assigned him the roommates we did, especially knowing how eager freshmen are to be accepted. As far as I'm concerned, we created the problem. Henry is a good kid, a good student, and an asset to the school. And after all, we are first and foremost an educational institution. I feel Henry has learned a valuable lesson from this experience, and I see no need to punish him for a relatively minor offense in a way which could affect his whole life." Although Robert's decision was based on his own personal values and interpretation of the situation, you can see that he certainly did not make his decision irrationally. Lauren, a feeler, and Jerome, a thinker, are a good example of how people who are different on this preference can provide important balance for one another. They work together in the editorial department of a health and fitness magazine, and they have come to appreciate each other's values. Lauren is very perceptive about people, explains Jerome. When I have trouble with a particular writer, or when I can't understand why someone is acting a certain way, I'll discuss it with Lauren. She's always able to see why the person is feeling the way they are, and sometimes how I've been responsible. Lauren's insights and suggestions about how to handle specific situations have bailed me out on many occasions. For her part, Lauren says, Jerome is probably the most honest person I know. Not always the most tactful or diplomatic, but the most honest. I always go to him when I want to know what the logical thing to do is, instead of just going with what feels right to me. I don't always like what Jerome has to say, or the blunt way he says it, but I know I'll always get a truly objective view, something I need and appreciate. Thinkers can be analytical to the point of seeming cold, and feelers can be personally involved to the point of seeming over-emotional. When thinkers and feelers clash, more often than not the feeler ends up hurt and angry, while the thinker is confused about what went wrong. Tony, a feeler, is a salesman for a large office furniture manufacturer. He booked a morning flight to Chicago to attend a lunch meeting with some representatives from a company that was refurbishing its offices. Tony's boss had flown in the night before in order to wine and dine these important prospective clients. When Tony arrived an hour and a half late to the important 10 o'clock meeting, his boss was clearly irritated. Tony explained that one of the engines on his first flight had burst into flames en route, necessitating an emergency landing, complete with waiting fire trucks, in Detroit. After he'd waited for 2 hours, the airline finally found Tony a seat in the first-class section of another flight so he could complete his trip. When his boss's first question was how much the extra first-class accommodation had cost the firm, Tony stared at his boss with astonishment, hurt at his apparent lack of appreciation for what Tony had just been through. Tony's boss was baffled and said, "I don't understand why you're upset with me. It's not that I don't care about your safety, but it's obvious that you're all right, so now I'm simply curious about the added cost. To help you decide which preference suits you, see which side you would take in the following disagreement." Tara, a feeler, has a tough decision to make. Because of a restructuring of her company, she is being forced to lay off one employee from the marketing department. The choice has come down to Ted, a 57-year-old with 22 years at the company, or Alan, 36, who joined the firm 2 years ago. Both men have similar job descriptions and satisfactory performance. At a meeting with her boss, Kate, Tara explained why she would like to keep Ted and let Alan go. Ted has been a loyal employee, and I appreciate the fact that he is always willing to go the extra mile to get a job done right and to help others succeed. As far as his personal situation is concerned, Ted has one son in college and another starting next fall. His wife, Mary, is in poor health. I'm concerned that a man his age who has worked exclusively for one company this long would have a hard time finding a comparable job. Alan is young, ambitious, and mobile. He'll have no trouble finding a good job. Besides, I feel that by rewarding loyalty and hard work, we make all of our employees feel better about working here. Kate, a thinker, sees the situation differently. No one's saying that Ted isn't a great guy and a good employee. Personally, I've always liked him. But this decision has to be based on what's best for the company, not what's best for one individual. Ted's best years are behind him, and it's unlikely that he will ever move up. Alan's best years are ahead of him. He is senior management material. With proper grooming, he could become a very important asset to the company. Also, because of his seniority, we pay Ted $20,000 more than we pay Alan. And there is a greater likelihood of significant healthcare costs down the road for Ted than there is for Alan. It's an unfortunate situation, but it just doesn't make sense to keep Ted and let Alan go. If you vote to keep Ted, chances are you're a feeler. If you vote to keep Alan, you're probably a thinker. The American population is evenly split between thinkers and feelers. However, this is the only type dimension in which clear gender differences show up. About 2/3 of men prefer thinking, and about 2/3 of women prefer feeling. We aren't sure to what extent these results are due to socialization. Thinkers, step back, apply impersonal analysis to problems. Feelers, step forward, consider effective actions on others. Thinkers, value logic, justice, and fairness. One standard for all. Feelers, value empathy and harmony. See the exception to the rule. Thinkers naturally see flaws and tend to be critical. Feelers naturally like to please others. Show appreciation easily. Thinkers may be seen as heartless, insensitive, and uncaring. Feelers may be seen as over-emotional, illogical, and weak. Thinkers consider it more important to be truthful than tactful. Feelers consider it important to be tactful as well as truthful. Thinkers believe feelings are valid only if they are logical. Feelers believe any feeling is valid, whether it makes sense or not. Thinkers are motivated by a desire for achievement and accomplishment. Feelers are motivated by a desire to be appreciated. Once again, we'd like you to estimate where you think you belong on the continuum below. Thinking, feeling, judging, perceiving. The fourth dimension of personality type concerns whether we prefer to live in a more structured way or in a more spontaneous way. Again, there is a range between opposite extremes of behavior. People with a preference for judging, we call them judgers, tend to live in an orderly way and are happiest when their lives are structured and matters are settled. They have a judging attitude and like to make decisions. Judgers seek to regulate and control life. People with a preference for perceiving, we call them perceivers, like to live in a spontaneous way and are happiest when their lives are flexible. They have a perceiving attitude and like to stay open to all kinds of possibilities. Perceivers seek to understand life rather than control it. Judgers are not necessarily judgmental, they just like to have issues resolved. Perceivers are not necessarily perceptive, they simply like perceiving options. An important distinction between judgers and perceivers is the issue of closure. Judgers experience tension until closure is reached and are constantly drawn toward making a decision. Perceivers, on the other hand, experience tension when they are forced to make a decision. They avoid closure and prefer to keep their options open. Everyone uses both judging and perceiving in daily life. As with the other preferences, no one behaves strictly one way or the other. It's good to seek a balance of judging and perceiving, since judgers run the risk of becoming rigid, dogmatic, and inflexible, and perceivers run the risk of leaving things open-ended to the point that they procrastinate their lives away. When Cynthia, a perceiver, volunteered to put together a blog for a local bookstore, the other employees were enthusiastic. Cynthia seemed natural for the job. She was easygoing and well-known in the community. She also was artistically talented and had created blogs before. Cynthia set about gathering important dates and ideas for posts. But weeks went by and no posts appeared. When pressed for an explanation, Cynthia was unperturbed. She explained that her mother had come to visit, one of her children had gotten sick, and she and her husband had gone skiing one weekend and she hadn't gotten as much done as she'd hoped. In addition, she was having trouble gathering some of the facts she needed and she hadn't yet been able to reach a few people. Eventually Cynthia posted something, and the process began all over again. In 6 months the bookstore published 4 entertaining, informal blog posts of which Cynthia was very proud. This all drove Ashley, a manager at the bookstore, absolutely wild. Ashley, a judger, expected a new post to appear each week, and she expected the main page to include a calendar of all the important dates for that month. Ashley was so irritated by Cynthia's performance that she eventually took over the blog herself. She had no trouble whatsoever gathering the information she needed, and if for some reason an article was missing, she simply posted without it. Ashley created a professional and succinct blog for the bookstore. Though the posts were sometimes dry, they were always on time. Judgers prefer a planned and orderly world, living with structure that has a beginning, middle, and end. They like to be in control of what is happening and they like to make decisions. Judgers tend to see things in black and white and like to come down on one side or the other of an issue. They are more comfortable when issues are settled rather than being left up in the air. Even if they aren't the ones making the decision, judgers may not be particularly adaptable, and they generally don't like surprises. Perceivers like their world to be flexible, allowing for lots of opportunities for spontaneity. They feel constrained by structure and prefer things to be free-flowing. Perceivers enjoy adapting to new and changing situations and tend to delay making decisions. They leave things open-ended whenever they can, wanting to suspend judgment as long as possible. Perceivers see issues in shades of gray and enjoy the unexpected in nearly all areas of their lives. Jeff and Amy decided it was time to finally get in shape, so they went together to the sporting goods store to buy bicycles. Jeff, a perceiver, found a salesman, and over the next half hour asked him about 100 questions. He wasn't sure which bike was best for him, and he was troubled by the store's returns policy. Jeff finally left, saying he'd have to think over his decision. On the way home, he stopped at 2 other sporting goods stores to get a little more information. Amy, a judger, looked over all the bikes on display for a few minutes, then found a salesman and asked, "Which bike do you recommend?" When the salesman showed her the store's top-selling bike, she said, "Fine, I'll take it." In the work world, these two different styles can create conflicts, especially when judgers and perceivers are under pressure together. As is always the case, it helps to be aware of other people's preferences. Knowing that people naturally behave differently can make irritating behavior not only easier to tolerate but also easier to anticipate. Irene and Susan, both employees of a corporate training department, were assigned to co-train a one-day management development program. Each of them had conducted this program individually many times before, but this was the first time they had worked together. They divided up the portions of the program each would be responsible for. Irene, a perceiver, was to start the program at 8 and conduct a 30-minute introduction. Then Susan, a judger, would present the first section, which would last 1.5 hours until the morning break at 10. At 8, 7 of the 25 participants had not arrived. Susan wanted to get started anyway, but Irene opted to wait until all were present, which took about 15 minutes. During Irene's introduction, several people had questions about the program. Susan diplomatically tried to interject that many of the questions would be answered as the day progressed, but Irene decided it was important to address them at that moment. By the time Irene finished, it was 9, which meant that Susan had only 1 hour in which to make her 90-minute presentation. She raced through her presentation, barely covering all the necessary information, and ended the segment feeling disorganized and very stressed. At the 10 o'clock break, Susan was furious and confronted Irene. They soon found themselves in a heated conflict. Susan accused Irene of having poor time management skills and said she'd acted irresponsibly. She pointed out that Irene's mismanagement of the morning had put her in the position of having to scramble through her presentation. Susan felt that it had been ridiculous to make 18 people who had come on time wait for 7 who hadn't, and she said that rushing through her notes had made her look ridiculous. She felt that she had not had enough time to present her part of the program effectively, and she resented the fact that all of her careful planning had been ruined for no good reason. Irene felt that Susan was overreacting and was being too rigid. She thought it was entirely appropriate to wait for the missing third of the participants. Moreover, she regarded interruptions as a typical and often necessary part of the program. She felt it was important to address questions early on in order to set the right tone for the day and knew they could make up the rest of the program later. Irene didn't appreciate the fact that Susan had tried to cut her answers short, and said she felt that Susan had undercut her authority in front of the group. Since the two women still had a full day's program remaining, they ultimately realized that they had better figure out how to work together more smoothly. Irene promised to watch the clock more carefully, but was still committed to keeping the lines of communication open between herself and the program participants. Susan promised to try to be more flexible about what was discussed when, but she reserved the right to remind Irene of their schedule in front of the group. Fortunately, the rest of the program went without incident. One indication of your preference between judging and perceiving may be the condition of your desk. Typically, a judger's desk is fairly neat. It is well organized. There are spots for pencils, pads, paperweights, and so forth. And these items can usually be found, at least at the beginning and end of the day, in their proper places. The in basket contains information to be reviewed, and the out basket is reserved for completed work. Important information is filed away in a manner that allows for easy retrieval. It is not unusual to see on a judger's desk a list of things to do with a line drawn through most, if not all, the items on the list at the end of the day. A perceiver's desk, on the other hand, is often considerably less organized. It might contain several works in progress, messages that need to be answered, toys, malfunctioning ballpoint pens, and perhaps the best indicator of all, the just for now pile. When put on the defensive, perceivers will always claim that they can find anything they need in their office. The condition of your desk can reflect how your mind works. Let's say a judger and a perceiver both receive a brochure announcing an upcoming conference that is to take place in 4 months. The judger is likely to do one of the following. 1. Throw the brochure away because he went last year or already has a prior commitment. 2. Fill out the application. Write out the check to cover the registration fee and send them in. Or 3. Pass the brochure along to someone else who might be interested. The judger makes a decision and gets the brochure off his desk. The perceiver in the same situation is likely to behave differently. First of all, 4 months into the future is a long time from now. Recognizing that a lot could happen between now and then, the perceiver believes it's too soon to make a decision. He realizes he should file the brochure someplace, but if he does, he'll probably forget all about it. So instead he adds it to his substantial just for now stack of papers and folders already occupying space on his desk. Unless it is truly important, the brochure is apt to get lost in the pile, only to be discovered after the deadline for registration has come and gone. The perceiver doesn't make a decision, so the brochure hangs around on his desk until the time for decision-making has passed. Everyone has a to-do list or a just-for-now pile. That's not unusual. But perceivers are likely to have all kinds of items in their think about pile. And they can probably recall several opportunities they missed because they procrastinated too long. In the American population, about 60% are judgers and 40% are perceivers. There are no gender differences. Judgers are happiest after decisions have been made. Perceivers are happiest leaving their options open. Judgers have a work ethic, work first, play later. Perceivers have a play ethic, enjoy now, finish the job later. Judgers set goals and work toward achieving them on time. Perceivers change goals as new information becomes available. Judgers prefer knowing what they are getting into. Perceivers like adapting to new situations. Judgers are product-oriented. Perceivers are process-oriented. Judgers derive satisfaction from finishing projects. Perceivers derive satisfaction from starting projects. Judgers see time as a finite resource and take deadlines seriously. Perceivers see time as a renewable resource and see deadlines as elastic. As you think about which preference suits you, keep in mind that circumstances often force us to behave in certain ways that don't necessarily reflect our true self. Most of us have to behave like judgers at least part of the time, particularly at work. If you have a demanding job, you have to get there on time, meet deadlines, and make lots of decisions. To complicate things further, as your personal and work lives get more and more intertwined, it may become increasingly difficult to tell which is the real you. In this case, try to step back and see which preference would give you the most satisfaction if you could behave any way you wished. It's time again to estimate your preference on the continuum below. Judging, perceiving. Now that you have estimated your preference for all 4 type dimensions, you should have a 4-letter type. Refer to this continuum from earlier to remember what those 4 letters will be. How we interact with the world and where we direct our energy. Extroversion, introversion, the kind of information we naturally notice. Sensing, intuition, how we make decisions. Thinking, feeling, whether we prefer to live in a more structured way or in a more spontaneous way. Judging, perceiving. Congratulations. By going through this exercise, you have more than likely identified your personality type. However, the process of making sure that you have identified your type correctly requires one more step, which we call verification. Verifying your type. Chapter 3 contains verifying type profile for each of the 16 types. After reading the brief introduction to the chapter, we will ask you to find the profile for the type that you feel reflects the code you came up with in step 1. For example, suppose you estimated your type preferences to be extrovert, sensing, thinking, and judging. You would first find and read the ESTJ profile. If ESTJ is really your personality type, then you will probably think that it describes you very well. In fact, most people are taken aback at just how well their type profile describes them. If you feel this way, then you have very probably verified your type. We say very probably only to discourage those of you with the tendency to make quick decisions from foreclosing any other possibilities which might be better fits. So until you have read several other chapters that describe type more thoroughly, we suggest you think of the type you come up with by doing this exercise as a sort of working hypothesis. On the other hand, if you read ESTJ and you think it sounds somewhat like you, but not very much like you, then you probably haven't yet identified your one true type. If you find yourself in that situation, here's what to do. Go back to the continuums for each of the preferences. Note which ones you marked closer to the center line. Then see which ones you marked farther away from the center lines. Using the ESTJ again for an example. Suppose that by going back you discover that you felt pretty clear about your preferences for extroversion, sensing, and thinking, but less clear about your preference for judging. Well, it's possible that you may really be an ESTP rather than an ESTJ. As you will learn shortly, these 2 types, while identical on 3 letters, are very different from each other in many ways. Therefore, you will want to read the ESTP profile as well. If it turns out that your preference really is for perceiving rather than judging, then the ESTP profile should fit you much better. Thus, you may have to go through this process of examining a few types to find your true type. You may ask, but shouldn't I be able to identify my type right away? Not necessarily. Often circumstances just don't permit people to be themselves. For example, you may have had parents who encouraged only certain kinds of behavior. Or you may have been obliged to do what was expected of you instead of what interested you. Some people who experienced very difficult childhoods were forced to adopt certain kinds of behavior as a form of self-defense. This, too, can affect how you see yourself and can place a barrier between the you who survived and the you were meant to be. This is the time to try to determine who you really are deep down. It is important to carefully pin down all 4 of your preferences, because your personality is in large part determined by the unique way in which your preferences interact with each other. Perhaps you're familiar with the concept of synergism. Basically, synergy occurs when the whole of something is greater than the sum of its individual parts. This is certainly true of type, and as useful as it is for people to know that they prefer sensing to intuition, for example, No one is just a sensor. People who prefer sensing come in 8 different varieties, depending upon their other preferences. And it is the combination of preferences that results in such useful information, although you don't have to know your personality type in order to benefit from the rest of this book. You'll certainly get more out of Do What You Are if you can successfully identify your personality type before going on to Part 2. As you review this chapter and read the next one, please keep in mind that there is no time limit for discovering your true type. The type police will not come crashing through your door if you haven't verified your type after finishing Part 1. Take your time and review this material as much as you need. Keep refining your working hypothesis until you have identified the personality type that most accurately reflects you. Then have a little celebration. You've found the real you. Descriptions of the 16 personality types in the next chapter draw substantially upon the following works. Introduction to Type. A description of the theory and application of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. By Isabel Briggs Myers. Introduction to Type in Organizations. By Sandra Krebs Hirsch and Jean M. Cumero. Manual. A Guide to the Development and Use of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. By Isabel Briggs Myers and Mary McCauley. And Gifts Differing. By Isabel Briggs Myers. All of these books are published by Consulting Psychologists Press, Inc. And certain material in the next chapter is reprinted with permission of Consulting Psychologists Press, Inc. Note: for each profile, we provide an approximation of the percentage of this type found in the American population. These percentages were developed by Dr. Charles K. Martin of the Center for Applications of Psychological Type, Gainesville, Florida.